is Lucy and I live in Northern Ireland. In 2050, I will be 35 years old. This is the story about how Northern Ireland got its very first Climate Change Act.
What?
Maybe before we start, we should cover some basics first. As we all know, climate change is a big problem that needs many solutions to solve. Across the world, individual countries have been bringing climate change laws to try and do their bit to help. A climate change law is supposed to set the plan for how a country intends to do its bit to stop climate change. This means reducing greenhouse gases and turning to greener ways to live, work and play. Although Northern Ireland is on the island of Ireland, it is part of the United Kingdom, along with England, Scotland and Wales. The rest of the island is known as the Republic of Ireland. Like Scotland and Wales, Northern Ireland has its own parliament, which has responsibility for things like education, health and the environment. Northern Ireland's parliament is known as the Assembly and can be found at Stormont in Belfast. Up until 2022, it had 108 elected politicians, known as MLAs, and a central government known as the executive. These arrangements are part of the Good Friday Agreement, which brought peace to Northern Ireland after many years of conflict. England has a climate change law. Wales has a climate change law. Scotland has a climate change law. And the Republic of Ireland has a climate change law. For many years, Northern Ireland was the only part of these islands not to have its own climate change law. And then finally, something amazing happened. And it all started with a big, fat no.
Ridiculous.
Specific Northern Ireland legislation was needed to sort of drive action to set the policy, to make sure people knew what we needed to do, and specifically say this applies to us. We need to take action here. We can't leave it to others. We might be a small region and people may say overall our contribution is small, but we needed that direction and that drive to say we all have to take responsibility and do something. So,
this wasn't something that we invented the need for. It was something that was put in the New Decade, New Approach. Climate change legislation was supposed to happen for Northern Ireland, and it just didn't.
We've been led down the garden path for years. You know, Westminster got its Climate Act 15 years before. Scotland, the Republic of Ireland, they're all in their second or third iterations of Climate Act. You know, the request was very modest and very reasonable. You know, we wanted to put in place the architecture of good climate legislation.
Our demands, most moderate, are we only want the earth. So said James Connolly over 100 years ago. Those were modest demands, then and now, but I'm sure he could never have imagined that 100 years on we would have to add saving the earth to his requests.
It became clear after the election that the numbers were there, and we certainly identified that if you add up all those who said they were in favour of the Climate Change Act, they formed the majority in the Assembly. So we seen and identified a clear route that this could actually get passed. It wasn't going to be without difficulty, but the numbers were there to get this over the line.
On the 3rd of February 2020, the Northern Ireland Assembly declared a climate emergency. This means that a majority of its politicians understood the problem of climate change and wanted to take action to stop it. One of these actions was to bring forward a climate change law.
Stormont had declared a climate emergency, and the motion included an ask that a Climate Act was brought forward within 100 days.
The government department that should bring forward climate change law is the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs, called DERA. It was headed by a politician called Edwin Poots. His political party is the Democratic Unionist Party, or DUP.
We had a minister who wasn't particularly popular, not even within his own party. And he was a Minister for Climate Action within the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs.
A 3 month time frame is impossible to achieve. It is ridiculous to ask for it.
Minister Poots stood up during that debate and laughed at everybody in the chamber basically and told us it was a ridiculous time frame, that he wouldn't be rushed, that he didn't again like the language of emergencies and breakdowns and he would do it in his own good time. Well,
because I'm not a politician who gets too hung up about motions and about regulations and all of that.
The culture of how we view and care for our land must change.
I'm very pleased to see the acknowledgement of climate change as a human rights issue within this motion.
The world, Temporary Speaker, is facing a climate emergency with potentially disastrous consequences.
If we are to combat the devastating environmental, health, economic and societal impact of climate change, we have a responsibility to act globally, locally and as individuals.
The Climate Coalition NI is a group made up of students, trade unions, environmental charities and many academics with expertise in climate change.
The reason Climate Coalition NI came into focus for this was because there was not one party who was able to take a lead in totality in bringing everyone together, whether that was in terms of bringing stakeholders together in different parties and different sectors across society, or just having the actual resource to do so. So that's where Climate Coalition NI came into it.
I think the dynamic of that group was especially crucial to getting this climate change legislation over the line.
Climate change is the single biggest threat to the places that National Trust looks after. So we all have to play our part in tackling it, whether that's reducing emissions, capturing more carbon. All of the environmental NGOs will feel the same.
I was astonished that a Minister for Environment in an era of climate breakdown wouldn't listen to his colleagues, wouldn't abide by the democratic will of his colleagues to introduce climate legislation.
And this idea that was stemming from the Department of the Environment, you know, like, who do you think you are?
It felt like there was no choice based on that. Like, if we were told no, ridiculous, whatever, that there was no alternative but for us to do something about it.
The second issue is that it also indicated a lack of preparedness for the need to develop climate legislation. So obviously this should have been something that had been in the pipeline for a very long time, but in fact clearly hadn't been. So they should have been in a position where they could have done it within 3 months, and they weren't, and that's why civil society had to step in.
And we knew there was a limited timetable until the end of the next elections, the end of the Assembly. So we knew if we were going to get something through in that mandate, it had to be worked on quickly.
Prior to that, people who wrote laws wrote them for government, that they were part of government. The fact that someone who was not part of that system could write a law and that might be passed was just something so out there and so outlandish. But we had no alternative. We just had to do it.
Well, I went through the Kubler-Ross anger, frustration, depression in seeing that a minister who is making decisions that's going to affect me and my kids, that was so patently anti-science, that did not understand the severity and the urgency of what we're facing. While I'm naturally impatient as a person, it even made me redouble my efforts, and I said, right, I'm going to help.
We also had the analysis to recognise that we can't wait any longer, that we weren't going to be strung along the way we've been strung along before in relation to promises for the environment.
The impetus to be part of this legal group to try and bring about legislation was the fact that it was necessary. That was the impetus, and that had been a long time coming.
If they are not going to do anything about it, then there's no choice but for civil society to step in and do something instead. There's just no option.
If you want something done right,
You're standing up in a space where a minister has flatly refused to take action and has refused to take action for over a decade. So it felt nerve-wracking, it felt like a challenge, but it felt like the time is now to do this.
So it all started in a café where we met Friends of the Earth and Anurag, and we just discussed the issue and decided he was going to write a climate change act. And we said, yeah, do it.
This was sort of August 2020, I think, when I was first approached. So I'd been furloughed for about 4 months. I had a lot of time to, watch a lot of Netflix and then get bored. And the fact that there was nothing coming from the department or the executive, I thought, well, I suppose we just have to move ahead with it as civic society. So that's exactly what we did.
So Anurag Deb, a lawyer and an academic, began to put together a climate change law for Northern Ireland. This is usually the job of the government.
The bill, when it was finally drafted, and when it was in a draft that we all agreed on and could be submitted, it wasn't setting out like, this is what you do to stop climate change. All it did was set a set of rules that should be followed. And those were comparative to all the other pieces of climate law that had been brought in across the UK and in the South. So it wasn't radical. Just the way it came about was radical. The fact that it came from an external civil society movement. And we had had the benefit of being able to see the climate law in operation for many years in other jurisdictions. So we just honed it in based on that.
Anurag did very well to step up and draft the first iteration of the bill. He produced a extensive, interesting, well thought out draft. As was no surprise, it wasn't the ideal finished product. It's a draft, and it was refined down over the course of the activities of the working group, which I was part of, so that we crystallized a less radical, more focused, fine-tuned climate change bill that became the bill that Claire Bailey introduced.
It is huge. It's probably among the most sweeping kinds of bills that Stormont has ever considered. So the scale of it was daunting, yeah.
It's shocking, really, that it did come down to just normal people or civil society to do this. This is the job of government. This is the job that they should have been doing right from the start. It's the job the minister should have been doing. But of course, we know he said there isn't an issue here, and not on my watch was his exact phrasing. So, that's shocking, and it's appalling that it did come down to people like us to do that when it should have been them.
It was a very collaborative process, so you did have academics, NGOs, lawyers, and not just people from within the environmental world, but people beyond that in terms of social justice and other issues like that.
When the work was initially done and produced, it was a fantastic feeling because it was the culmination of work and activity from a vast array of people and participants. It was a grassroots success. It achieved support and buy-in from people in elite political spheres, but also the NGO community was right behind it. The Climate Coalition was driving it. Everyday people helped bring that together.
On a personal level, it was pretty exciting. It was pretty empowering. Sometimes I talk about how we need a more participative democracy, that instead of us citizens just waiting for politicians to do and for us to vote on people and then they go off and do what they want to do, that for us to be able to shape the democratic process was really exciting.
Officials or ministers were saying it's not done like that. You actually can't do that. And we knew that it could because we had laid the groundwork.
We didn't really know, but we were willing to give it a go.
The principles behind this bill weren't just about good climate governance. We also wanted the bill to be cross-community. We wanted support from unionism and nationalism. And that was always so important. And that support was there within the Assembly.
I was delighted to support the private member's bill on climate change on behalf of Alliance because I knew, as my colleagues knew at that time, that a major driver was needed to bring forward the required climate change legislation in Northern Ireland when Northern Ireland was lagging behind every other region on these islands.
I think the bill was very important to sponsor because obviously we had climate denial for many, many years from successive ministers and parties in Stormont. We had inaction for years as well. They occasionally did talk about the threat of climate change, but really did nothing about it and continued on with business as usual. So for me and my party, it was important to sponsor a cross-party bill that probably didn't have everything that we wanted in it, but that kind of took an important step in the right direction to tackle emissions and to move quickly towards zero emissions. So I think it was very, very important for those reasons.
It's not that complicated. It was all about getting us to net zero as quickly as possible. It was about providing oversight for that process, creating targets along the way, and making sure that whole process was fair.
Net zero means reaching a balance between how much greenhouse gas we put into the world and how much is taken away.
There was a net zero target no later than 2050. There was the provision for climate action plans and a carbon budget or carbon budgets. There was provision for a climate office and a climate commissioner, and then one of the key things was the provision for a just transition. And all four of those things were in the private members' bill, and those were key.
Normally, the government writes the bills and presents them to the Parliament. But in this case, the climate change bill was presented by Claire Bailey, a politician and the leader of the Green Party. Nearly all of the other political parties in the Assembly supported the climate change bill.
And what happened was on the 100th day, not just did the skeletons and the bare bones of a bill come forward, but a whole bill had been written. The engagement had happened with all political parties, and every political party elected to the Assembly, bar the TUV and the DUP, had signed up to support this bill, and I was able to lay that with the Speaker on the 100th day and introduce it as a private member's bill, so it was absolutely stunning. And from there the battle began, but certainly Minister Poots did not see that one coming, and that was a very funny day.
There is a special process for turning a bill into an act. Firstly, a politician introduces the bill to the Assembly and its title is read. This is very simple and it is known as the first stage. Then there is a second stage, where all the elected politicians of Northern Ireland talk about the bits of the bill they like and the bits they don't like. Then they vote on whether they want to look at the bill in more detail. Next, the politicians form themselves into small groups that have special knowledge of what the bill is about, and they look at it in detail. This is called the committee stage. In this case, the climate change bill went to the Agriculture and Environment Committee. The committee can ask anyone they want for their views on the bill. They look at every part of the bill in great detail, and at the end, they write a report to tell all the other politicians what parts of the bill are good and what parts they should change. Then, the bill goes back to the full Assembly for what is known as the consideration stage. This is when every word of the bill is looked at by the whole Parliament. Each politician votes on whether each part of the bill should pass into law. After this stage, there is one final stage called the further consideration stage, when politicians get a final chance to change things. After that, the bill goes to the Queen or King for a final stamp of approval. This is known as the Royal Assent. Then, finally, the bill becomes an act and is law. The committee!
A committee is there to scrutinise prospective legislation and to hold their relevant minister to account.
I found sitting on the committee scrutinising the private members' bill with my name on it really, really tough. And it wasn't just tough in terms of the workload that went along with that. It was tough because I had never done this before. I didn't know what it was to be scrutinising my own bill on a committee.
In front of all this committee, in front of all our colleagues and different experts watching and thinking, we're really leading something in Northern Ireland. We are driving the first climate change bill for Northern Ireland. We are creating history here.
And to be part of that was very exciting, so I was very happy to give evidence to that. And my colleague, Dr. Munzer, who's an expert in climate laws, was able to also, articulate in a very clear way the features of climate laws across Europe, which are becoming, are delivering best practice in terms of, the transition to net zero.
Better preparedness amongst different sectors?
Yes, appearing before the committee for the first time. Exciting, it was an interesting experience. You're entering into a fairly contested environment because the bill was considered by some to be controversial.
The top line target of net zero was incendiary. That was the thing that those who did not want to push for strong climate law hated about our law.
Lord Deben.
Lord Deben, who is the chair of the Committee on Climate Change, which is really the major expert body on climate change policy and targets in the UK, came to Stormont to give evidence to the Agriculture and Environment Committee. And then,
as far as the North of Ireland is concerned, what we have recognised is that the particular problems mean that it cannot reasonably be sure of reaching net zero by 2050, but that it can do 82%.
He just couldn't bring himself to think that there's maybe other forms of regenerative agriculture that can restore the soil, that can restore the air, that can feed people decent, wholesome, proper food, that he was totally locked into this expansionist business model.
The Committee on Climate Change advises government and the devolved administrations. It reports. It does not set policy. Who sets policy? That's the members in our assembly if they're passing the bill, or devolved executive, people that we elect to set it.
But if it is 82%, you've got to do it. You've actually got to do it. And that's the deal, if you like. And that's why I am so determined not to offer something that you can't do. I think there is something wrong in that. I mean, I really mean morally wrong. You must not ask people to do things that they can't do.
Honestly, it may not have been the worst thing that happened to our bill. It was kind of like, I was like, wow, I can't believe he just said that.
Lord Deben respectfully made a mistaken comment when he claimed that it's morally wrong to set an aspirational target that can't be achieved, because in the context of what he was saying, he was indicating that a net zero target for Northern Ireland for 2045 or perhaps 2050 was unachievable. But that's not the case, because of what the CCC have told us directly, his committee, that there's no material reason why Northern Ireland cannot achieve net zero.
So that was quite concerning, and it also kind of contradicted the evidence that we had been drawn on to a certain extent. So we had been really referring to research by the World Meteorological Organization, by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, other groups, the United Nations Environment Programme, all these big international bodies that are saying we're living in a climate crisis, we need to take urgent action.
Northern Ireland isn't some special place where our atmosphere is somehow contained and we can keep our carbon emissions here, and it's just nonsense.
Ulster emissions.
Yeah, Ulster's emissions.
It was the Air Committee chair, so it was Declan McAleer, Sinn Féin MLA, asking Lord Deben, making a perfectly valid point.
Do you not think it'd be better if we should be looking at this on a single island basis?
The island of Ireland is one island, and it's a single biogeographical unit, and Dublin's just gone for a net zero 2050 target, and should we not align, or should we not consider the fact that we all share one island? And Lord Deben says,
we've created for ourselves a divided Ireland, and we've created for ourselves a United Kingdom outside the European Union. My own views on both those subjects are well known. They're well known about Brexit. But the fact of the matter is we now have to live with it.
The fortunate outcome of Lord Deben coming to committee was that those opposed to the bill had a field day, and it sectarianised climate action, which is a global issue, and all of a sudden it became about, like, do you go with alignment with the UK or alignment with Ireland?
We've got so many policies in this place that are like geared towards one side or another of constitutional aspirations. But the fact is, by the time Lord Deben had come to give evidence to the ERA committee, GB was net zero. Dublin was just on the verge of adopting its Amendment Act to enshrine net zero in law, which means actually by the time you get to 2050, it doesn't matter whether you're part of the UK or you've gone into United Ireland, you're going to have to do net zero either way. So it was a great opportunity de-sectarianising climate change, which is something that affects all of us anyway.
It is a politically loaded judgment based on science, but he's not a scientist, so no one should take that just for granted, you know.
Our bill was setting out this very clear net zero target, and that just riled people. That was the controversial side of things, and I think it was because of what their inference was about net zero. So the idea that if we had to meet net zero, we had to sacrifice certain things, as if those certain things and those sacrifices were set in stone, and they're not at all. The idea of having a strong target was that we would have strong aspirations to meet that target, and that in meeting that target we would be well placed amongst other jurisdictions who were also meeting it, and we would benefit from whatever steps that they were implementing to meet net zero. Anything less would have kept us in the position of a perpetual laggard, which wasn't going to help either.
Laggard!
Yeah, laggard was a word I introduced to the discussion with reference to Northern Ireland being, in essence, a drag on the UK's national mitigation processes. Remember, net zero 2050 is a requirement for the UK. The UK will hopefully hit that. Northern Ireland may not necessarily. Is it going to look to other jurisdictions to make up for its shortfall? Do we want to be in that position?
The gap between where we were before we had the climate bill and what most other jurisdictions neighbouring us and within the EU are reaching was just increasing. And if we didn't take action now, we would not just stay static, we would fall further behind.
The added feature that troubled me was the suggestion that that's Northern Ireland's traditional place. That's us. We're always behind the curve. You know, we can't. It cannot be expected of us that we would actually get ahead of this and do anything that others might envy and want to emulate in some way.
It was a bit of a challenge to see how many times we could get laggard in there, just to see. And I think some of the MLAs were picking up on it as well. I think that it was coming back at us. So yeah, that was great. That was great to see that you kind of just inject this, kind of seed this concept, and then you see it coming back at you. It was nice.
Northern Ireland is already a climate laggard, and we can't allow us to continue to be a climate laggard. We need to catch up.
And I think we were then able to, I hope, give a fairly convincing evidence session to the committee where we just sort of said, look, it's a no-brainer, as we've said before here, that this needs to happen and it needs to happen now. And if it doesn't, Northern Ireland, the north of Ireland, is going to be left behind. Left behind now, it's going to be left behind forever.
Net zero was the headline target within our bill, and for some reason that was really controversial. It's something that's been reflected in climate laws across the board, but apparently in Northern Ireland it was seen as just a bridge too far. It was too much, too soon.
Bills are like buses. Claire Bailey's climate change bill had completed committee stage and with a lot of support was likely to become a law. In March 2021, Edwin Poots and the DAERA introduced a second climate change bill.
Well, Bill 2 came along because the Minister was playing catch-up. Now, I don't know if maybe the department and the officials were working on the bill already. The Minister says there was one coming and he would bring it at his own time. Maybe this was it, I don't know. But they were caught on the hop. We'd introduced our bill, and we had not just introduced it, but we got to consideration stage, and that was the real crucial part.
We had poured our hearts and souls into getting the perfect piece of climate legislation across. Whether it ended up that way, that's up still the debate, but it felt like a complete disrespect that so many parties and so many sectors had come together to try and get this piece of climate legislation across. And we had tried to involve all parties. We had tried to involve the DUP, the TUV, the departments, and it fell on deaf ears. And so it actually just felt such a moment of, right, what are we going to do? How are we going to overcome this?
I named it the Bad Faith Bill, because when I looked at it, I said this is set up with a view to having the absolute minimum impact. I think the new terrain of climate politics is climate delay.
Leapfrog. Leapfrog.
Then there came this moment when the second bill, because of it being a government bill and its bigger wheels and its faster moving pace, just jumped over all the work that had been done in Bill 1. Like, how did that make you feel?
Everybody was gutted, disillusioned, so disappointed because the rug had been taken out from under our feet.
It felt like, Minister introduces the proper climate change bill that we should have had, and the Climate Coalition's bill is just far too radical. And no one actually sat down and thought, what's the right bill for Northern Ireland at this point in time? But it felt like that was just immaterial, that the Minister's bill was going to go ahead and that normal service resumed.
And that second bill had the explicit intention, in my opinion, to derail the first bill.
Yeah.
And how sneaky is that of a government with all its resources to take away something quite reasonable that civic society were demanding that had the support of the majority in the Assembly.
And it was almost as if the government just produced the bill that the agri-food lobby would be content with. And we had these two rival bills. And so as if the issue wasn't polarised enough, and it became a real, are you Bill 1 or are you Bill 2?
I think it was a really strange situation having a second bill brought forward. Normally in those sorts of situations, if the government of the day supported the private member's bill or supported the principles behind it, then they would work with the team on that bill and make it better. So to have a competing bill introduced and to have to work through the consultations that involved and everything that surrounded that, it was a lot of work, and it was a lot of unnecessary work.
Bill 2 initially, in my view, was introduced as a partial means to subvert Bill number 1 in the sense of kind of playing politics. It was going to be very difficult for Minister Putz and his party, the DUP, to outright vote that bill down because it had a huge groundswell of support publicly and in the Assembly at that time. So their recourse, their fallback, was to introduce a second bill, which is an unconventional thing to do. The mind boggles if you think it through, but why not disagree with those two bills and introduce a third? Why not introduce a fourth? So Bill number 1 set the backdrop for Bill number 2. And if you look at the components in Bill number 2, without running through them, they are in no small part modelled on Bill number 1.
So the minister asked for a meeting and we met with him. He says, I have to leave it to you, it's not really my bag. It was just, would we be willing to work with his officials to see, could we maybe work on merging the two bills? And we said, yeah. And we did then enter a process of negotiations, and we were willing to meet, and we did that several times. But I have to tell you that has been the most brutalising thing that I've ever done. They had no mission of even being open to a conversation. Every single meeting that happened, we were being talked at, talked down, talked over, told that our bill was stupid, unenforceable, not workable, the policies are impossible, you don't have a policy background, you can't write a business case, your targets are there. And it was just sort of, well, this isn't really going to work.
There came a point beyond which you just had to say, realistically, the two bills are not going to be merged.
And I cannot stress enough how little resource that we had.
Yeah.
I think people think there are big teams but there really was not. and we had to do it because we didn't have any other choice. But it was stressful. Like it was really hard.
And then the behind the scenes stuff, so you're constantly negotiating with other political parties, making sure that they're still on board. Other ones that are falling away, that they can't support this that they once did, and now that and you're doing all that background politicking as well as learning the whole sort of institutional process, as well as dealing with the real public vilification, as well as a real tight timeline during a pandemic while Brexit is happening. It was just, it was so hard.
And the end of the mandate was coming so quickly.
Yeah.
We didn't know if we'd have the time to do it.
In May 2022, an election was to be held. This meant that the public got to vote in new politicians to form a whole new parliament. Any work still to be done by the old parliament would be scrapped if it wasn't completed before this election.
People started to say, I think they were just like, yeah, this bill is badly drafted. Even though it wasn't badly drafted, it was actually very cleverly drafted. And Thomas Munzer, who wrote the book on climate legislation, thought that it was excellent. So I knew that it wasn't badly drafted, but it just became this term that you just fling around. People that were opposed to it said this is badly drafted.
I think we should start a band. Badly
drafted.
Amazing.
In the long run, it was a few short months.
Yeah.
But actually, it felt forever because we were the four of us were having conversations every 5 minutes on the phone, clarify this and amend this and blah, 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 blah. But also at the same time, every time I went on Twitter, there was another article about how we were a danger to society and why this was just going to be an absolute disaster.
So you're all very welcome to this rally in support of an ambitious and robust and science-based Climate Change Act for Northern Ireland. And we want our politicians to be true climate leaders and create the frameworks necessary for real climate action based upon a just transition. A strong, impactful Climate Change Act is an essential part of our collective journey to a healthier, fairer and sustainable future for current and future generations.
Our climate bill is literally a new way of lawmaking, and it's much needed. We know the old way does not work. Not for people, nor for planet.
The world is on fire. If we don't act, and we don't act now, and we don't act radically, it will be absolutely too late.
Climate denial has now been replaced with climate procrastination, and it is just as dangerous. We cannot kick the can down the road in regard to this particular issue, in regard to the climate emergency, because there isn't going to be a road if we do that again.
The UFU were representing the large corporate agri-food industry. They weren't representing poor farmers smaller farmers who've seen their share of income decline year on year.
The opposition protest here and the debate generally certainly was very polarised at that, and I think that was a strategic intention of the UFU and others to try and make this out as in this was a group of detached lefty greenies trying to put rural Ireland and rural Ulster out of business and all this sort of stuff and break the backbone of communities is really heavily emotional language. Then secondly also better resourced massive organisational structure and so on. So it was really important to have farmers who were progressive on the climate question coming out and having their voices heard to say no, they do not represent us, we're also rural and our livelihoods and the future of farming and agriculture depends on a climate act to some degree, and it would also been key to have those rural voices.
The debate has been driven down to the farming community by corporate interest.
We came up with the idea that we needed to tell a story, make the Climate Act relatable to Joe and Josephine, and we wanted to bring what's quite complicated, difficult conversation to everyone's kitchen table. And so we thought the way that we could sell that message, or tell that message even, is that we could tell it in a way with normal people like us just saying why it was important to them. Why do we need strong climate legislation? Why is it really important that people act now?
I support the strong net zero climate change bill.
The transition to a green economy will create 50,000 jobs in Northern Ireland.
There is no more time to act. It has to be now, or it's going to be too late.
When we had the DUP and particularly Edwin Poots as the person in there. You could see how the battle lines were already going to be predetermined, and of course that's how it turned out. Farmers versus the climate change bill was basically the media story that dominated the framing of the whole climate change issue. Because the reality is, in politics and policy making, if you're explaining, you're losing. And certainly I found myself when I was doing media interventions and commenting on the climate change bill, that was already the predetermined frame.
In our work, we had engaged with groups like Farmers for Action and Nature Friendly Farming Network, indeed who became a member of CCNI. And we know that a lot of farmers want to take part in climate action, and their voices were swamped and drowned out by the likes of the UFU.
There was no real time for me to hit back at what was being thrown at me. At one stage we had the whole huge, powerful agri-food lobby taking out double-page spreads in the newspapers, for goodness sake, with a huge big advertisements saying that everybody in Northern Ireland needs to reject Claire Bailey's bill, and they just kept calling it Claire Bailey's bill and really demonising me on that one. The level of misinformation and scaremongering that has taken place, fuelled by some on these benches and the agri-food lobby, is shameful. Many countries that are heavily reliant on agriculture have set net zero targets, amongst them the Netherlands and the Republic of Ireland, whose targets have not signalled the end of farming in their countries. Instead, they've paved the way for funding and support to flow into the sector.
When you look back at whatever opposition there was to the Climate Act, that was only from one sector, and only from within an element, albeit a wealthy element, within that one sector. The energy sector, the transport sector, the wider environmental community, the community sector, most business leaders, they all supported a Net Zero Climate Act. They could see the direction of travel we wanted to go on.
Yeah.
So I think whilst the opposition was there, and they were quite well resourced because they come from quite rich corporate organisations, it suddenly became clear at the end of the process that, hold on, this has been orchestrated. This is not a groundswell of public opinion. We had public opinion on our side.
When they came to protest at Stormont, they brought children with high-vis vests that said on the back of them, Claire Bailey, hands off our future. So it wasn't about climate, it was really vilifying me as a person. But because everything was moving so fast, I didn't have the luxury of time to sort of fight back on my own behalf. I had to keep pushing to make sure that we did not end that mandate without a climate bill, and that was my only concern, really getting that done. But it was brutal, and you have to think, and the Minister calling me out on the floor as well, that I'm an urban dweller, I'm a city dweller, what would I know about farmers? This wasn't about farmers. I was having farmers from right across Northern Ireland writing me handwritten letters that they left unsigned, unnamed, begging me to keep doing what I was doing, because they knew that they needed it, and they knew and they know that we do need to make those changes as well. So we really had the powerful agri-food corporate sector who make huge profits every single year on the back of farmers who are living in poverty, from a minister who does not put the policies in place to make their conditions better, that they don't get a fair price for the produce that they make. And this is what I was getting from farmers on a one-to-one level, on an anonymous level, to keep going, please stick with it, we're right behind you, but we can't be public, and please don't ever name me.
Every year, the United Nations hold a giant conference to discuss climate change. Many different people from all over the world come to these conferences each year. They are called the Conference of the Parties, or COP for short. In November 2021, it was the UK's turn to host the 26th COP, and it was held in Glasgow, Scotland.
So COP happened in November in the middle of committee stage. At that point, I think that the debate here had become so insular. So as a climate activist, I had lost sight of what we were doing. I was getting so sucked into those arguments. And then I was in Glasgow for a COP, and I think that was good too, because you meet these activists from all over the world that have gone through so much to even get there. Indigenous women, Indigenous groups, they're talking about, you know, they're being murdered for their activism where they are. They can't even get a meeting with their governments. They have to come all the way to Glasgow to get in the room with the people who are doing these harms to them. And you hear from people who are living through the extreme weather events, their communities are dying, like floods, droughts, and it kind of just like reinforced, why are we doing what we're doing?
Our future, 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 our planet, our planet, our planet, our planet.
Yeah, the COP26 rally, I think it was just a massive uplift, because I think we're probably coming off a wave when Stormont was down for those 3 years. There was a lot of civil society protest, and what was maybe conspicuously absent from that was a really mobilised climate movement. I mean, obviously you had Fridays for Future and some of the school strikes and so on, but it was huge, and it was like a real, I don't know, an indication that we were making progress and making waves, and that people were like, right. And it's kind of like the politics are out there and people want to be able to contribute towards, especially young people, towards a really vibrant climate movement here. And when there was a vehicle to get behind and there was a touchstone, like a bill, an act, whatever it might be, I think once you had that, people were like, right, now you can fall in behind that.
We are running out of time. We know you can act when you see something as a crisis. So act now.
We can no longer wait. So I ask you all here today, what do we want? Climate justice. When do we want it? Now. What do we want? When do we want it?
It began to feel that we had managed to find groups of people that we could work with and that and felt the same about this crisis, that should actually be gaining traction with others, and people that we didn't even know and would never know were actually beginning to agree and to think, yeah, maybe there's something we can do about this.
The COP rally in Belfast was so broad, so it wasn't just the usual suspects in the climate coalition, but we had trade unions there, we had just so many young people's organisations, young people's representatives, we had farmers there. Despite all the toxicity that was being injected by the Ulster Farmers Union, we did have farmers there. So it was a great moment, you know, and suddenly thousands of people turned up, and it was extraordinary.
There were so many people who were just unaffiliated. They were just people who turned up because they wanted to support the march. They were people marching, you know, families, young people, older people, everyone just turning up. And it was a really galvanizing moment, and it was a really nice thing just to, after months of, like Claire said, after months of this sort of negative, you know, demonizing rhetoric, just to have so many people gathered to say, no, this is what we want, this has to happen.
I remember finding myself, and it was one of the highlights of the whole thing for me, I found myself walking with a 94-year-old blind woman, and it was such a privilege to walk with her. As she told me she had been working on environmental issues almost all her life. And she said, and here we are. COP26 produced, because it happened here, that focus on something that a whole group of disparate people had come to realise was really fundamental.
So the front of the march was this incredible banner, and I was lucky to be able to hold that banner among sort of very distinguished climate activists. And there was a picture of that march. The caption said, "Young people marching for climate change." And I was delighted. I was so delighted.
This body of people were way ahead of their politicians. And that's the real thing that I really hope we don't lose, because there are sort of ebbs and flows in these things, and one wants to keep hold of that recognition that we had then and make sure we don't lose it, because the need is still there.
Climate change in general and how it affects Northern Ireland had never been talked about as much. It was on the news every night. Obviously, the COP rally gave it a massive boost.
But if ordinary people and civil society are moving ahead of the politicians...
They're not laggards.
Yeah. So who are the laggards, really?
I actually remember when the First Minister resigned in February, and then on the news was the story that we have all this legislation that is now going to fall. So the first thing we did was to write to the Speaker at the time, in the Speaker's office, and said, there may not be a First Minister, we may be a number of weeks out before the end of the Assembly, but we need to get this legislation over the line. And the climate change bill is and was one of the most significant pieces of legislation that Assembly has ever produced, so we need to get it over the line. And to be fair to the Speaker's office, and I'm sure they were lobbied by other sectors that were looking for legislation as well, they really ensured that as many bills got over the line before the end of March as possible, including the Climate Change Act.
But because he was a minister, because of his position in the executive, it was able to move faster through the scrutiny process. And so we saw then this bill just really ramp up. It accelerated, moved really quickly through the different stages.
Amendment Day.
Amendment Day was chaos, primarily because we still had two bills on the table, and we wanted to amend the Minister's bill that looked like was going to get over the line first to contain all the good bits of the other bill. So you had, I don't know, it was probably over 100 amendments. Then you had to be quite meticulous and going through all of the amendments and the consequences of the amendments, and to explain to all the MLAs why you wanted them to vote a certain way, and explain all of that, and just hope that they voted the right way on the right amendments. So that was a lot of work in a very, very short period of time.
I'm sure most of the House welcome the progression of local climate change legislation that would allow our businesses, agriculture sector, industry and public service to move
It really
forward.
was a team effort across every person, every sector, every organisation. Anyone who'd had anything to say, they were saying it, and it was about making sure the most accurate climate aware voice was the loudest.
With the overall target within 24 months of the bill receiving Royal Assent.
Many of the amendments on the table today hark back to
What we really want to get across with climate legislation is that you don't have to be the most qualified researcher to understand the climate crisis. You can just be someone who wants to learn and wants to make the world better. And that meant, yes, politicians spent a good bit of time learning it, but it meant that the information was accessible and that there was going to be a way forward to creating this climate aware society.
So, Minister, 82% isn't going to cut it, I'm afraid.
The original climate change bill has served a significant purpose in that it has prompted the Minister to do his job in relation to the climate change issue.
This amendment has been modelled on a similar provision in the Scottish Climate Act.
The bill that had been put forward by the Minister was amended to make it more like the private members' bill. In fact, there was, by the time the legislation came around, it had been amended 107 times. Because of the will of the politicians, they knew what needed to be in a proper bill and they drove it through.
It's time that we set a new direction for Northern Ireland.
We had to trust the politicians, we had to trust those who we were in meetings with every week, that for experts in the field that they had imparted enough knowledge and that we had brought all the political parties on a journey with us to understand exactly what they needed to amend and when, and we got there.
Amendment Day became Victory Day. I don't like using that militaristic language, but it was the first time in my life sitting through or watching parliamentary debates in Northern Ireland thinking, these guys can do it.
Yeah.
These politicians have stuck to their guns.
They're
There's another
listening.
militaristic word. But they listened and
Yeah.
they had everybody's briefings. They seemed to understand
Yeah.
the complexity between the two bills. And I was so proud of them.
I think by the end, there were some things that were pretty solidified, like the Climate Commissioner and the Just Transition people got it and they felt like they understood it was essential. But then it meant that when the second bill came along, they were so sick of talking about climate legislation, and they were just like, where's the Just Transition? Where is the Climate Commissioner? And it ended up that the recommendations for the second bill were just make it look like the first one.
It came with a few caveats that we're not very happy with. There was a methane exemption, but the principle of net zero and that Northern Ireland could have it because everywhere else had it was thoroughly picked up by politicians and was shoved in to the framework that had been set out by the department. And the beauty of having a second bill, which we all hated at the time, was that we had this vanishing mandate. The Stormont was going to end, and if we didn't get a climate change law passed, it might never pass. And the minister's bill that raced ahead became the vehicle for us to allow climate change law to pass. So it got heard quicker, it got completely altered to reflect Bill 1, and then it passed.
So after all our amazing work, our collaboration, widespread engagement on a scale that we've never seen before, the Climate Change Bill number 2, which had been massively amended by our co-sponsors and by other MLAs, that received Royal Assent in June 2022. And so it's a milestone. It's a massive milestone for Northern Ireland. It's the first ever piece of climate legislation that we've had. And I know it wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for Climate Coalition and I, if it hadn't been for our work, if it hadn't been for Claire Bailey, if it hadn't been for all our co-sponsors, our legal team. It wouldn't have happened without Anurag Deb and Laura Neal and Thomas Munzer and all these other people that played a key role.
It's so cross-cutting, it touches every aspect of our society, our economy, of our law, just how we live, how we function, how we travel, how we heat our homes, just everything about how we do everything is touched by the Climate Change Act.
It's going to change how billions and billions of pounds of the budget are going to be spent in many, many years to come.
That approach will get us an independent environmental protection agency because we will write the bill if the government isn't prepared to do it.
Yeah.
And we know they probably won't. That approach also built so many relationships within political parties and between civic society and political parties.
Yeah. Was it easy? No. Would we do it again knowing what was ahead of us? Probably yes. But the resilience that has been born out of that, where you stand in the shoes of government, you do what they should have done and failed to do, and they come after you for it, and then to still win out at the end of it. It's a great feeling.
It's as good as we could have expected in the coalition, given the powerful forces ranged against us. The fact that this really was a David and Goliath. The coalition with a David, by the way, in case you don't get the analogy, no resources or very little resources, volunteers, some of whom spent themselves into exhaustion and, almost had themselves broken because of their commitment and the work that they have done. And I'd be eternally thankful for them on behalf of me and my children in terms of the work that was done against the might of the state, represented by the executive, the Dairy Ministry, the Minister, the very powerful lobby group that is the Ulster Farmers Union. And it ranged against those powerful corporate, business and state forces. To see the bill as it came out is nothing short of miraculous and historic. And I think people need to be fully cognizant of that, that you fought the law and the law didn't win. You changed the law. So there's the clash rewritten.
And that was the story of how Northern Ireland got a Climate Change Act. My name is Lucy, and in 2050 I will be 35 years old. I really hope that I can look back on this in 2050 as the start of something that will make a real difference to life in this small corner of the world.